All right, guys, we are going to take a look at another kind of intellectual virtue. Remember that an intellectual virtue is a character trait that is conducive to being a good thinker, a good learner, and even a good communicator. The name of this intellectual virtue that we'll be working with in this lesson is named by the sign intellectual empathy. Okay? And of course, you're creating the triangle appropriately, formatting it and whatnot as need be. As we know, the top of the triangle will have the official definitions. We're going to write that as a note up here. Again, we don't label the parts of a concept diagram when we're creating one. This is just an additional little note, which is why we have the arrow up. But if I ever tell you to construct a diagram, a concept diagram, you wouldn't do something like that, right? This is just to remind you that in this document, the official definition is right here for the concept named by these two words, and that is two L's. It's not supposed to be a V. So go ahead and put the information that I told you to, I might have told you to put on the other documents for intellectual virtue up there. Make sure you get that done. All right, so let's take a look at intellectual empathy. So intellectual empathy is making a genuine, sincere attempt to imaginatively put oneself in the thinking place of others so as to genuinely understand their reasoning and or conceptual frameworks. Notice that the definition says reasoning or conceptual frameworks. It does not say emotions or feelings. This is empathy, but not the kind of empathy that you might be more familiar with, which has to do with feelings and emotions. This has to do with reasoning, logic, the structure of people's concepts, and how they hang together. Hence, not just empathy, but intellectual empathy. All right, so this is going to be one of those examples where we are going to do a text box to shed light on the information. For this one, I'm going to have to break my own rule just a little bit, and we're going to go down to about that part of the triangle, and we are going to create a text box. I think if I write small enough, actually, I don't have to break my rule. I really don't want to break my own rule. So the text box is actually here, but we're going to have to write really small because what I want to shed light on is, well, in what domains or from within what points of view, from within whose or what reasoning or conceptual frameworks can we make an attempt to genuinely understand where another person is coming from. So this applies to your peers in and out of the classroom. In the classroom, of course, when you're doing group work, collaborative work, discussion, things of that nature, peer sharing. Pretty soon we'll be doing peer interviews and listening to each other's points of view. Friends. Notice how small I'm writing so I can fit everything in here. And of course, you can make this video bigger. Of course, family, co-workers, religious people or religious figures. So maybe you have some of you might have a pastor, but even if you're not religious, you can make a genuine attempt to understand where a religious person might be coming from. And we could even just say, of course, your peers, friends, and family could be religious, and vice versa. Who else? Politicians, professors, scientists, and then there's kind of another domain that I want to start right here. Books / readings. Okay. Disciplines. Subjects. Fields. branches. And what I mean is the fields and branches of a given discipline. Remember, this is a philosophy class, so philosophy is a discipline, so you can learn to think from within the standpoint of philosophy as to why that discipline thinks that what it's doing is so important, for example. But then we can break this down, and obviously I'm getting more into an academic realm of more academic-oriented context in which it is possible to be intellectually empathetic, because then we can drill down and we could say theories, to think from within a theory, even if we disagree with it. Theories, I meant to say theories, theories, arguments, and of course, concepts. Okay, a lot of this pertains to this class exactly, of course, but we can even break it down a little bit more and talk about the different philosophers that we're going to come across, their arguments, their theories, their concepts, philosophy's way of approaching and making sense of whatever it is that we're focused on in this course. All right, so what is this shedding light on? This is shedding light on the word others. And I'm going to elaborate on that. So I'm already wanting to do the lecture part of this that I wanted to do in another lesson, either in another module or in class, if this is a face-to-face class. But I'm going to make myself wait because I don't want to make this video longer than I think is appropriate. Okay, so an example. I'm going to use religion again because it's just so easy to use religion. So let's just say Sally, a devout Christian tries to understand arguments for the claim that God does not refer to anything real, as well as arguments for the claim, for the opposing claim. Okay. Sally, a devout Christian, tries to understand arguments for the claim God does not exist. And really the claim is this right here. Claim God does not, refer to anything real. That's the claim. As well as arguments for the opposing claim. God, the word God, does refer to something real. Now, the reason why I put two kinds of arguments with opposing claims, obviously there is an argument that she would be more aligned with as a Christian. But one thing I want you to understand and that I'll emphasize soon enough, is that nowhere in the definition does it say that the view of the other, that the other's reasoning or conceptual frameworks has to be one that contradicts you. That's not what it's about. You don't even know if somebody else's reasoning, logic, point of view, concepts, how they define them, conceptual structures, how their concepts hang together. You don't even know if you agree or disagree with them, or the extent to which you agree or disagree with someone, until you've made that genuine attempt to understand where they're coming from. And one thing to keep in mind is that just because someone holds the same belief as you, for example, abortion is wrong, you can have two very different reasonings for that belief. And so you shouldn't assume that because somebody aligns with your basic standpoint on a given topic, that they actually have the same logic. You would want to first ask them about the logic for that shared belief, so that, and in doing so, make a genuine attempt to understand where they're coming from. I'm going to clarify some more things about this in an upcoming lesson when it comes to intellectual empathy, just like I will the other intellectual virtues. Again, notice how I have the examples part of my triangle at the appropriate part of the triangle. It's not way up here. If you have any of your examples for any of these lessons about intellectual virtue, if you have it way up here and then you have nothing down here, that could be a deduction, because really you want to show that you're trying to put stuff in the right place. So having nothing over here by the angle and having it all up here would not be a good thing. You'll need to fix that. Okay, so now, of course, we're going to do some elaboration. I want you to go to the other notes, and I want you to copy what we put next to the word elaboration in the other part of the packet. Pause the video if you need to do that. All right. So again, notice that I have I statements. It used to say you or one, but I thought I want to make this more personal, and so I decided to put the word I in there. So if you are someone who is intellectually empathetic or trying to be, then you are someone who can affirm these statements. As we read through them and fill them in, I want you to be thinking about the extent to which these statements are true of you, or is it more true of you in some context about some topics more than others, and whatnot. Okay, so things an intellectually empathetic would affirm. I recognize that human thinking emerges from the various conditions of, right here, I want you to write the word life. And I'll probably say something more about that in class. I make a genuine effort to acquire accurate, clear, precise knowledge of another's POV. What do you think POV stands for? I want you to write it here, point of view. From now on, when we write the word point of POV, we mean point of view. And when I say point of view, I want you to understand, draw this arrow, that I'm talking about someone's reasoning and or conceptual framework. So you can see that I've got my, like, it's a hyphenated arrow, if you will. Okay, so not feelings and emotions, but their point of view insofar as we're talking about their thinking, their logic, their arguments, their reasoning, things of that nature. Okay, guys, also remember that the only markups and writing that you can have on your documents for a given module are those that I tell you can be on there. You cannot add additional things, or you should not, especially, well, I can't get into the especially part, so ignore that. I will say something about that later. Okay, so I am willing to work through a set of, and then here we're going to write a word that I really stressed the first day of class, a word that names probably the most important concept of the first day of lecture. It starts with an A. Can you guys remember what word that starts with A names the probably the most important concept that I iterated on day one? Ends with S. T-I-O-N-S. Assumptions. So I want you to write assumptions, okay, other than my own. Okay? It's like you're saying, I'm going to try to think like you do from the standpoint that you do. If I accept certain beliefs as true, or I try them on, or I just pretend they're true, can I understand then where you're coming from? Even if I don't really think your assumptions are actually true, your starting fundamental beliefs are actually true, if I pretend they're true, can I see where you're coming from? Okay, so that is a major skill to have, is to think from a set of assumptions other than your own. Okay, so I recognize and admit why, write small because we've got quite a bit to write here, why and how someone might find their own POV compelling, persuasive, put backsplash, compelling, persuasive, and then for the last word, I want you to write valid, VALID. Okay. I critique another's thinking. Again, this is just a catch-all word, POV, which goes back to what? Reasoning, conceptual frameworks, okay, ideas, thinking. Only after I have made a genuine attempt to really understand it. To really understand what? Somebody else's point of view. When I say another's or somebody else, again, I want to reinforce the idea. It's just a point of view that is being articulated from or coming out of someone else, either through text or verbally, okay? So again, it's not saying others who disagree with me, with those who oppose me. No, you don't know if somebody opposes you or disagrees with you or to what extent until you really try to understand where they're coming from. Not just their main beliefs, not just their conclusions, but what is actually supporting those conclusions, what is actually supporting those beliefs. Okay, now, kind of similar to intellectual courage, there are two dimensions to intellectual empathy, but they are dimensions relevant to intellectual empathy. Now, all of these intellectual virtues interconnect, but each one has its own little to add to intellectual virtue. And so I might say a little bit more about the connections. Hopefully you're making some connections between the virtues soon enough. And as it turns out, there is actually a reason why I lay out the intellectual virtues in the order that I do in a given module or lesson. I don't enforce you going through a module in a particular order, but there is a reason why I have the virtues in the order that I do. There is a logic to each module. There's a reason why I have some lesson first and then the next lesson. So you should always do the module in the order. And I want you to be looking at that. Why might I have introduced intellectual humility before intellectual courage? Why might I have introduced intellectual courage before intellectual empathy? Why might I introduce all of those virtues before intellectual perseverance? Okay, so dimension one of not this bullet point, but of intellectual empathy as a whole is I try to understand another's reasoning, logic, arguments, explanations, okay, point of view, kind of, that's our catch-all, right? So trying to understand another's. And again, look at all these others. These are the others that I'm talking about, and maybe we've left out some categories of others. Dimension 2. Okay, so dimension 2 really has sub-bullets, so it should be like this. So if there's two dimensions, we could do like this to emphasize that. And then dimension 2 has two sub-bullets, if you will. Okay, so dimension 2, I try to understand another person's concepts. Okay, so in other words, their particular concepts, the different concepts that they have. Okay, what is your concept of this? How do you define it? What do you count as an example or a counterexample? Oh, okay, well, let's look at this concept that you're using. How do you define it? What do you count as examples and counterexamples? So understanding their individual concepts maybe in isolation, right? But also trying to understand another person's conceptual framework, meaning what? How their concepts hang together, connect. And then I want you to write to each other, close that. And then a little cool diagram to draw for this point would be to take here's a concept, here's a concept, here's a concept. Maybe these concepts are being used as an argument. And if you practice intellectual empathy, you try to understand each concept, but also how the concepts hang together to form a point of view, whether it's a theory, a reading, an argument, a discussion point, something like that. And of course, you can have all kinds of connections. A person can have all kinds of connections among their concepts.